Good afternoon and welcome to our TV show featuring documentaries revealing the realities behind myths using research and scholarship. I'm your host Ergün Kırlıkovalı and I will be with you every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You're welcome to send me your feedback at mythsandrealities.com. In episode 70, we discussed how academic freedom was seriously put at risk by silencing dissent and suffocating free speech. We were reminded how a professor's, UCLA historian Stanford Shaw's home was firebombed in 1977. Apparently, some people were enraged when the professor's detailed research in his 2-volume set of books, History of the Ottoman Empire and Modern Turkey, exposed Armenian revolts, treason, territorial demands, European interference, and the resulting enormous Turkish suffering, which triggered the 1915 temporary resettlement or TERESET decision by the Ottoman Empire for the wartime removal of the logistic base of Armenian insurgency. This was only one case in the scholarly coverage of the Turkish-Armenian conflict at an institute of higher learning in a sea of violent reactions by some in the Armenian community. I covered Armenian terrorism both on US soil and around the world that lasted through 1970s and 80s, causing numerous innocent Turkish diplomats and their loved ones to be killed and scores wounded, along with billions of dollars in property loss in episode number 1. In 2008, the Southern Poverty Law Center publicly libeled Guenter Lewy, a professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, by claiming that Lewy was paid off by the Government of Türkiye to dispute the alleged Armenian Genocide in his 2005 book, The Armenian Massacres in Ottoman Turkey, a Disputed Genocide. The professor sued immediately and won. A settlement was reached where the SPLC agreed to issue a retraction and apology and pay the professor an undisclosed sum of money. In its apology, SPLC stated that they realized that they were wrong to assume that any scholar who challenges the Armenian genocide narrative necessarily has been financially compromised by the government of Türkiye. The good Professor Lewy replied with this succinct and poignant comment, I quote, "It must be possible to defend views that contradict conventional wisdom without being called the agent of a foreign government," unquote. In 2015, Justin McCarthy, a professor of history at the University of Louisville, Kentucky, and Bruce Fein, a Harvard Law School alumnus specializing in constitutional law, were scheduled to deliver talks at the University of Toronto. When the Armenian students became aware, they immediately waged vicious campaigns of vilification, defaming the two esteemed intellectuals, and bombarded the university president with protest letters demanding that the lectures be cancelled immediately. When the university stood its ground, the Armenian students raided the lecture and turned their backs on the history professor and the legal scholar, creating a rancorous and anxious atmosphere of hatred. Such Armenian campaigns designed to suppress free speech on campus begs this question to be asked. Is freedom of speech allowed only if no dissent is expressed? In 2016, George Gorich, history professor at Baylor University, Waco, Texas, was prevented from delivering a lecture at California State University, Northridge, when screaming Armenian students raided the room and chanted repeatedly obscene slogans right into Professor Gorich's face until he left the room. Susan Kruth of Foundation for Individual Rights and Expressions reported this unfortunate assault on free speech with this thoughtful title: historian shouted down at Cal State Northridge. Kruth noted that the protesting students comprised members of Armenian Youth Federation and the CSUN Armenian Students Association. Kruth remarked, and I quote, "Shouting down speakers with whom you disagree is not appropriate conduct in a setting that is meant to be the marketplace of ideas," unquote. This and other such incidents, too many to list here, designed to censor responsible opposing views on American campuses, was the topic of the 2017 book by Dr. Randy Bobbitt, a visiting lecturer at the University of West Florida, titled "Free Speech on America's K-12 and College Campuses." On page 195, Bobbitt quotes the First Amendment attorney C.C. Haynes as saying, and I quote, "Rather than shutting down speech, schools should help students master the skills of civil discourse, including the skill of listening to speech with which one profoundly disagrees," unquote. I concur. Instead of shouting down Professor Gorage at Cal State Northridge, for example, the Armenian students should have tried to listen to the speech with which they might disagree. Rules of engagement in a civil discourse requires patience and tolerance. Some people readily take the popularly accepted but racist and dishonest Armenian claims at face value, totally oblivious to the plethora of Armenian war crimes and hate crimes resulting in enormous Turkish suffering. To the official but incredibly flawed Armenian narrative, Turks effortlessly react with a barrage of simple but heart-wrenching questions like, "What is the Turkish suffering in the Armenian narrative?" And what about the Armenian revolts, treason, and terrorism? And what is the court verdict supporting it? And many others. Turks readily remind Armenians how Muslims, mostly Turks, were murdered by Armenians with refined cruelty, as described by two Americans who visited war zones in Anatolia in 1919, Captain Emery Niles and Mr. Arthur Sutherland. My goal in this docuseries, as I tried to explain last week, is to mobilize the forces of critical thinking in an effort to rectify misconceptions, stereotypes, falsifications, and fallacies using research and scholarship. I take pains to use verifiable facts while scholarly building my arguments on them. With what clarity and precision I'm able to achieve that goal is left up to the viewer's discretion. For this process to be fair, the viewers must honestly examine the evidence presented here without emotion or political considerations. This brings us back to the concept of free speech. The U.S. courts, created under Article 3 of the Constitution to administer justice fairly and impartially, defines freedom of speech as a right enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, allowing individuals to express themselves without government interference or regulation. Freedom of speech is protected by the First Amendment in the following immortal words: "Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech." The 5 freedoms the First Amendment protects are speech, religion, press, assembly, and the right to petition the government. Together, these 5 guaranteed freedoms make the people of the United States of America the freest in the world. The problems arise, though, when the Armenian lobby tries to restrict these freedoms to the Turkish Americans using the political system via systematic defamation, discrimination, intimidation, and ill-informed political resolutions. Where does that lead our society? Well, I covered global Armenian terrorism in episode 1 and documented crude Armenian falsifications misleading the public in episodes 2, 3, and 4. Then I detailed in episode 8 how the highest court in Europe, the European Court of Human Rights decided in 2015 that Armenian genocide is an opinion and rejecting it is free speech. In episode 67, I explained how the missing ingredient in the much flawed official Armenian narrative was critical thinking. It should be clear by now that we, the people of Turkish-American heritage, do not see eye to eye with Armenians on the characterization of the Turkish-Armenian conflict. But every time we try to present our case, we are defamed, bullied, harassed, and even subjected to assault and battery. Speakers who scholarly refute the genocide claims in university settings are systematically vilified, threatened, and subjected to endless campaigns of character assassination. With the 2013 verdict on Perinçek versus Switzerland, the highest court in Europe, of course, the European Court of Human Rights, has established that the events of 1915 cannot be proven to be genocide and therefore cannot be compared to the Holocaust. I still firmly believe that reasoned debate is what is needed, not censorship or intimidation, silencing dissenters. Only civilized dialogue can bring peace and closure when it's based on concepts of fair memory and shared pain. Anti-Turkism and Islamophobia, by far the biggest challenges to free speech, should be checked at the door prior to discussing the Turkish-Armenian conflict, a complex human tragedy engulfing all the peoples of the era and area, not just Armenians. Furthermore, Armenian war crimes and hate crimes can no longer be swept under the rug. Armenians had resorted to terrorism, revolts, treason, and caused more than 518,000 Turks and other Muslims to meet their tragic ends at the hands of Armenian revolutionaries between 1914 and 1920. Lacking historical evidence and legal support, Armenians focused on propaganda and political pressure, using deceptive comparisons with Holocaust to establish credibility by association. That is why the UN, the UK, Israel, and many other countries do not accept the use of the term genocide to describe the Turkish-Armenian conflict. History cannot and should not be enforced by opinion police. This concept was eloquently expressed by the French historians who opposed the draconian denial laws in Appel de Blois. Quote, "History must not be a slave to the contemporary politics, nor can it be written on the command of competing memories." Unquote. University is a vibrant place for exploring and enlightenment, not policing thought and canceling dissenters. Blindly insisting on the false claim of genocide will cause one to commit the crime of conscience called ethicide, which is defined as extermination of ethics via malicious mass deception for political gain. Victim of the crime of ethicide is the truth, not human beings. To avoid ethicidal mistakes or crimes of conscience, free exchange of ideas in a civilized debate environment must be encouraged. Along those lines, here's what Greg Lukianov, the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE for short, writes in page 243 of his 2014 book titled Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship and the End of American Debate. Unquote. Lukianov adds that universities could help bridge the political gulf in this time of hyper-partisanship by fostering discussions across political and personal divides. He says, unless speech codes, campus censorship, and heavy-handed techniques that stifle debate come to an end, the academy cannot, as the honest broker we so desperately need in the arena of political and cultural controversy. I couldn't have said it better. Professor Whittington of Princeton University adds his voice to the mix in the preface of his 2018 book titled Speak Freely. with these insightful words. I quote, "As I write, students mix with outside agitators in violent protests to silence and threaten conservative speakers at UC Berkeley, New York University, and Middlebury College. Universities that should stand as bastions of open dialogue and free speech have too often become sites of intolerance and intimidation," unquote. Whittington complains about how recent years have brought a steady drumbeat of news reports about speakers disinvited or shut down, or political faculty harassed, investigated, students disciplined or shunned, and signs and displays removed or destroyed. He adds that American college campuses have too often become sad displays of ideological polarization and repressive thought control instead of serving as examples of civil engagement among those holding opposing views. Then he drops his bombshell, I quote, "The current crisis of free speech on college campuses is both symptom and cause of a larger threat to the maintenance of liberal democracy itself," unquote. Free speech on college campuses as a threat to the liberal democracy. If you ponder a bit, you can see how that can be. Curtailing free speech as a form of intolerance, this intolerance has hardly any place in a democracy which thrives on diversity. If you silence diversity, therefore, you cannot have a true democracy. What Armenian students are doing when they are shouting down a scholar or canceling another is hurting democracy. I thank the Princeton professor for bringing this little explored angle of Armenian violence in American campuses. Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media, is a 1988 book by E.S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. Herman was a professor of finance at Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania, and Chomsky, a linguist and activist scholar, author of many books. The book argues that the mass media of the United States are powerful ideological institutions that carry out a system-supportive propaganda function by reliance on assumptions and self-censorship and advertising. The title refers to consent of the governed, that is, the 80% of the people. The remaining 20% are well-educated, well-organized decision makers. This book made a profound impact on the generation of journalists. One of those journalists is Matt Taibbi, a contributing editor to Rolling Stones and co-host of Useful Idiots podcast. On pages 10 and 11 of his 2021 book titled Hate Inc., he says this, and I quote, "The book's central idea was that censorship in the U.S. was not overt but covert. The stage management of public opinion was normally not accomplished by crude intervention, but by keeping out dissent. Outside permitted mental parameters are also kept out," unquote. So true, so true. The almighty New York Times, for example, published a whopping 145 articles in 1915 alone, all defaming and demonizing Turks and the Ottoman Empire, while allowing zero rebuttals of any kind. Most, if not all, of these articles were ill-informed, misleading, and or fabricated. Some Armenian scholars, out of ignorance, bias, naivete, or outright spite, still use those incredibly flawed articles as references in their works today. Everyone believes in freedom of speech if it's their speech, forgetting that free speech is there to protect dissenting ideas, not repeating conventional wisdom. Taibbi further explains this censorship in U.S. media, and I quote, "The key to this deception is that Americans every day see vigorous debate going on in the press. This deceives him into thinking propaganda is absent. Manufacturing Consent," that is the book, explains that the debate you're watching is choreographed. The range of argument has been artificially narrowed long before you get to hear it." Unquote. Again, so true. Armenian scholars, for example, would arrange a panel of discussion of the 1915 events at some university, but never invite Turkish scholars to challenge them. Numerous written and verbal Turkish requests to be included in the panel would be rejected. Sometimes Turkish participation, even as a listener or guest, would be declined. And the unsuspecting audience would be denied to hear the responsible opposing views. I personally lived through some of these events where civilized debate was unwelcome. I plan to cover some of those unfortunate cases of campus censorship here in future. Cancel culture, or call-out culture, is a form of ostracism in which someone is thrust out of social or professional circles on campus or online. Those subject to this ostracism are said to have been cancelled. The expression cancel culture has mostly negative connotations and is used in debates on free speech and censorship, as we are doing right now. The bottom line is the cancel culture arrogantly displayed by some Armenian students dictates that scholars who want to express favorable views about Turkish or Muslim leaders must be excluded. That's the new suppression ideology adopted by the Armenian students, which would preclude talks by a wide range of scholars with valuable insight into countless topics and stimulate important conversations among students and faculty. Whereas, as professor of law at Florida International University, Stanley Fish wrote on page 45 of his book titled Versions of Academic Freedom, quote, "At the heart of the First Amendment is an egalitarian commitment to the equality of speakers and their ideas," unquote. So the Armenian students, by silencing dissent, are engaged in nothing less than violation of the First Amendment rights. As playwright David Mamet aptly put it on April 8, 2022, on Bill Maher's HBO program, quote, "When people who state an opposing view are not disagreed with, but are marginalized and canceled, we are going to end up with a totalitarian state because that's the way human nature works," unquote. Guenter Lewy, professor emeritus of political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, highlights in his 2014 book, Outlawing Genocide Denial, The Dilemmas of Official Historical Truth, highlights the danger that one kind of speech prohibition has on all speech. I think some college campuses seem to be hostile to speech that they deem offensive. Dissenting speech is erroneously labeled hate speech under the influence of Armenian propaganda and political pressure, whereas such dissenting speech, being undeniably true, is punished with banishment for being true. B.J. Cannon, political scientist and an historian, wrote this on page 350 of 2016 book, Legislating Reality and Politicizing History, wrote this, and I quote, "The accusation of a crime does not constitute proof of a guilt. Yet, contradicting a solid body of scholarship based on archival sources, this is precisely what the campaign for Armenian genocide recognition has accomplished. This is the outcome of extra-legal campaign for genocide recognition that attempts to legislate reality and politicize history. The possibility of reconciliation and resolution appears very slim indeed," unquote. And the beat goes on. I'm afraid we're out of time this week. Thank you for joining me. See you next week.